Well, I am very, very honored to introduce our presenter for this evening, Chief Richard Beal. Chief Beal is the former Director and Chief of Police of the Dayton Police Department. Chief Beal was appointed to that position by the City Manager, Rashad Young, on January 28th, 2008, and retired on July 30th, 2021, after spending 13 more years as the Chief of Police and nearly 43 in public and community service. Chief Beal served for 24 years as a Cincinnati police officer and for the last 6 of his Cincinnati career as the assistant police chief. Chief Beal was a former competitive powerlifter and martial artist, and his athletic pursuits included regional, national, and international sporting events spanning 1976 to 1992. Nearly 30 years ago, Chief Beal began to practice yoga as a means to emerge from a 2-year chronic depression. In 2015, Chief Beal authored the chapter Trauma in the Theater of the Body that was published in the book Moving Consciously, Somatic Transformation Through Dance, Yoga, and Touch, which discusses the potential of yoga to mitigate and heal trauma. In 2020, Chief Beal completed a master's degree in mindfulness studies at Lesley University. He has presented an introduction to mindfulness practice to several conferences and local workshops. He incorporates mindfulness within this yoga teaching. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Chief. We can't wait to hear your presentation.
Well, you're most welcome, Katie, and thank you for the gracious introduction. And one could look at this presentation, quite honestly, as mindful living. So those who understand that mindfulness, at least from its Buddhist roots, was much more beyond just a meditative practice. In fact, it was one of the elements of the Eightfold Path, right mindfulness. And if we're really going to be optimal in our efforts to live a mindful life, certainly our health and well-being and resilience needs to be a critical part of that. And that's really what the theme of this presentation is. It's been an evolving presentation over a number of years. I have given segments of this over a period of years, and then last year at the Ohio Crime Prevention Association, a 90-minute presentation. So this is only a subset of that larger presentation, because health, wellness, and resiliency for law enforcement is a very broad continuum. So we're only going to deal with a slice of that tonight. So if you're ready, we'll get started. So I particularly love this beginning slide because to me, it's really so representative of the very dark clouds that have kind of passed over law enforcement these last several years. In fact, I've commented repeatedly, I have never seen a more stressful time for law enforcement than these recent years. And that's over a 43 years career span. So nothing like this have I seen. So Richard Gerling, who is now retired from Hillsborough PD, is probably a familiar name to many of you because he's been one of the major proponents of mindfulness in law enforcement, has a website called the Mindful Badge. He commented as follows several years ago now. This is not a recent commentary by him. So really before many of the events, I believe even in 2019 and beyond, said police officers are suffering. So many stressors of being a police officer. The job is incredibly complicated. Organization is complicated. Legal climate complicated. Our relationship with the public is complicated. It's even more so since he said that. And thus far, police institution doesn't really offer us a whole lot that contributes to our resiliency, and that is preventative. And I think that's a sad commentary. I'll also say, unfortunately, it's still a true commentary, and then I'll show you that after another slide here. So this is just, I'm sorry, let me pause that a second. This is a segment, an excerpt from the 4th segment of a series called Mismatch Your Brain Under Stress. This was an interview I did with the American Institute of Stress in early 2019, before many of the tragedies that were to unfold in Dayton happened later that year and continued into 2020. In fact, this photo was the photo outside of City Hall after Dayton had riots on May 30th of 2020 in response to the murder of George Floyd. In this segment, I described some of those unique stressors of law enforcement, and that some they're not necessarily just law enforcement. So here's that brief segment. Clearly, 9/11 made policing a much more complex environment. We began to assume a significant role in Homeland Security. That was not a large part of our mission prior to 9/11. Clearly, it's a significant role for law enforcement ever since. The increase in this country, this escalation in active shooters, clearly that is kind of increasing exponentially. That's new terrain. Vehicle assaults, again, just wasn't heard of. I mean, we had times where cars or accidents where people, or maybe they're impaired drivers and they would drive into a crowd, but the intentional use of a vehicle as a weapon of mass destruction just was not in the terrain of policing. The racial polarization that has happened over recent years. I will just say, quite frankly, this was a very challenging night for regional law enforcement that responded to mass protests and following that, in some cases, public disorder.
Days of anti-police riots, dozens of law enforcement officers attacked with bottles, bricks, a Molotov cocktail thrown into a police van.
They say the front driver's side window was broken and there is evidence an accelerant was used.
And recently in Brooklyn, one officer stabbed, 2 others shot.
Property damage, assaults on police officers. So it was a difficult and challenging night, although not new. Once again, adds to the overall complexity and the stressors in law enforcement. Sleep disruption. The fact is that police officers have to work around the clock, and to the extent that we are working in overnight shifts, which is just in complete contradiction to how our physiology works. When the lights go out, we're supposed to sleep. Well, we have to stay awake all night long. So working overnight shifts, working rotating shifts, working shifts, and then having to disrupt sleep to show up for court the next day. So that in itself is a stressor. The demand to maintain attentional capabilities over long periods of time in threat-laden environments. You know, car after car goes by and nothing happens until there's a car that shows up and you're not as aware because of fatigue, and then you fail to notice the threat that's there. So just some of those stressors in law enforcement and in recent years. So there was an interesting study done in 2015 by Coons, McGuire, and Leach, and it was called the Health, Safety, and Wellness Program Case Studies in Law Enforcement. It was efforts to trying to assess the level of development of basically wellness programs or stress reduction programs for law enforcement. And this study commented a few things made a few comments of interest. One was that evidence suggests that policing provides a unique set of stressors that may place police officers at particular high risk for early deaths, heart attacks, and other health-related problems. Well, I think that probably is almost an understatement to some extent. Further, they commented research confirmed police officers have an elevated risk for adverse mental and physical health outcomes relative to the general population. The study continues and basically looked at wellness programs for in police and fire departments. It found that most focus on raising fitness levels, improving diet and exercise practices, and reducing body fat. You're going to hear that again tonight, but not just in isolation, I might add. But unfortunately, most health, safety, and wellness programs in police and fire departments have not been scientifically evaluated. So it is unknown whether and to what extent these programs are effective. In other words, do they result in behavioral change, and are those behavioral changes related to reduced risk for adverse health outcomes? That's the evaluations that need to be done. Most evaluations looked at the participants' satisfaction level. That's not an adequate measure, a measure worth looking at, but not an adequate measure in terms of determining effectiveness. Net result of these limitations is that we know a lot about the risk factors that police officers face. We know very little about whether various types of programs established to address these risk factors are actually effective. That's unfortunate and is inadequate. What are some of the ways that police officers die? Well, most of the focus is on line of duty deaths, and understandably so, because they are traumatic, they are tragic, and they affect the entire organization when someone is lost through a line of duty death. They're just tremendous tragedies. I've been through too many of them. And so we look at line of duty deaths over decades. These are average number of deaths per year by decade. And you can see there was a decline between 1990 to roughly 2010. And then this large escalation. I might add that this is the 2020 to 2022 average of 403 line of duty deaths. Overwhelmingly, in 2020 and 2021, leading cause of death, exceeding all other deaths combined, was COVID-19. I did training for a couple of cadres of new police chiefs in the fall of 2021 for the state of Ohio. And I asked those new chiefs how many who have established protocol for risk mitigation related to COVID exposure. And I was stunned by the number of hands that were not raised. This past year, 2022, while the number of COVID deaths does not exceed all their causes combined, it is now still a leading cause of death. The most deaths in 2022 were due to COVID-19. We need to work on risk mitigation for that. It's not going away. It's still here. And there's some speculation there could be a resurgence of a very virulent version of that in the next couple of years. So we're not out of the woods. We're just not. So to address the line of duty deaths, there was the Below 100 initiative that was created in 2010. There was an outgrowth of just a conversation, some police officers, they were having dinner. And they said, what if we just worked on trying to get the number of deaths below 100 a year, which was a laudable goal. It focused on four elements with kind of just a reminder. So wear your belt, seat belt, always wearing a seat belt. I'm surprised at how many police officers still won't wear their seat belt. It's unacceptable. Wear your vest, so wearing ballistic vests. Watch your speed. A number of police officers die in high-speed pursuits and they lose control of their vehicle. We've got to be able to manage the speeds that we're approaching when we're driving that vehicle. And then situational awareness. What's important now? Being in the moment, being aware, being present. And then just remembering complacency kills. Unfortunately, that goal was never reached in the decade of 2010 to 2020, and has gotten, obviously the data is horrible the last few years, primarily due to COVID-19. So beyond line of duty deaths, these are some of the ones we're trying to prevent, and they have a stress-related component. They certainly can play into some of these: felonious assault, fatal injury during arrest encounters, pursuits. I mean, my talking bar is right in the middle of that. Auto accidents, sudden cardiac death. I'll talk about that specifically a little bit later. Trips and falls, communicable diseases, COVID-19, just a horrible example. Toxic exposure to toxins in toxic environments, domestic violence, poor performance, avoidable critical incidents. All of these are potentially adverse outcomes related to stress. Chronic health conditions. We will focus on 3 of these: sleep disorders, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease. I'll touch a little bit on cancer. Mental health conditions, alcoholism, suicide. The data on suicide is truly troubling. It is not good for law enforcement specifically. So there is an effort to evaluate the availability of law enforcement agency wellness programs. And this was a 2022 study. It was a pretty robust study in that they looked over 1,000, more than 1,100 law enforcement agencies, doing a survey and trying to find out, do they have any kind of wellness programs? And about 80% of these municipal, almost most of the rest were county, a small percentage other agencies. They found that many agencies, 62%, almost 2/3, offered no wellness programming, no wellness programming. They did find, this is a little bit the more positive news, 23% had comprehensive wellness programs. And then another group is agencies had specialized or specific wellness programming. So a lot of room for improvement in terms of establishing just basic wellness programs within law enforcement. What are some of the key components? This is my list. This is not necessarily considered being an exhaustive list, but certainly very core components: good sleep hygiene, proper nutrition, promoting movement, exercise and cardiorespiratory fitness, optimal breathing patterns, just talked about a little bit at the very beginning, emotional health, strong social support network, a deep sense of purpose. Comes out of the work of Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the death camps during World War II. And he was developed something called logotherapy, and he identified the fourth human drive as the will to meaning. And he actually cited the philosopher Nietzsche, who says, whoever has a why can find a how. Do we have a deep sense of purpose driving our lives? So the last thing I mentioned in that small excerpt from American Institute of Stress was sleep, basically sleep deprivation, sleep interruptions related to shifts or having to disrupt sleep to go to court. My surgical resident son gifted me this book a few years ago. It is really a powerful read by Matthew Walker. A couple of things he comments: leading causes of disease and death in developed nations, diseases that are crippling healthcare systems, like it here in America, heart disease, obesity, dementia, diabetes, and cancer, all have recognized causal links to lack of sleep. And while balanced diet and exercise are of vital importance to health, sleep is the foundation on which the other two health bastions sit. Pretty powerful statement and true clarity about the importance of sleep. A couple of studies related to sleep patterns or sleep disruption or quality of sleep in law enforcement. One here that was by Rajaratnam and his associates. Almost 5,000 police officers, most participating in online screening, some on-site screening, wherein sleep disorder questionnaires were administered over 2.5-year periods. So that's a pretty good chunk of time to assess the prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, restless leg syndrome, narcolepsy with cataplexy, which is a condition of people losing control over their muscles, even potentially full or partial paralysis just after sleep. So pretty serious sleep disorder, shift work disorder, and sleepiness. Of the total participants, more than 40% screened positive for at least one sleep disorder, most often not previously diagnosed. Beyond that, there were those who had a positive screen for more than 1/3 had a positive screen for OSA. 26% reported falling asleep while driving a vehicle at least one time a month. It's interesting that Walker in his book comments that tired drivers are more dangerous than drunk drivers, because drunk drivers, while are slow to react, tired drivers don't react at all because they engage in micro sleep. So if we have a quarter of the individuals in our organization falling asleep once a month for driving a vehicle, that should be a shocking reality and something that begs for an urgent need to address. Beyond that, there was issues related to physical and mental health conditions for those who basically tested positive or screened positive for at least one sleep disorder. Also, health conditions, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression. Second study by Gabarino and his colleagues was a systematic review and meta-analysis, a very large-scale study of literature regarding sleep quality among police officers. They had 13 studies involving almost the 4,000 police officers. 11 studies reported on the prevalence of poor quality of sleep. And when all the studies were cross-sectional in nature, so that's not considered to be having a lot of scientific rigor. I mean, it doesn't mean it doesn't have any scientific benefit, but it's not the most rigorous type of scientific study. But and so it is, but moderate to low quality, generally speaking. But he found the pooled prevalence of bad sleep quality among police officers in the 11 studies that captured the data was 51%. That's unbelievable. Half had basically bad sleep quality. Not good. So a couple of organizations have weighed in on finally defining a metric for sleep. The first in 2015, American Academy of Sleep Medicine and Sleep Research Society. It formed a 15-member panel. It's a sleep duration consensus conference panel. And they released a consensus statement indicating 7 to 9 hours of sleep are appropriate to support optimal health in adults, while also reaching a consensus that 6 hours of sleep or less would be insufficient to do so. 7 years later, the American Heart Association weighed in and updated its Life Simple 7 predictors of heart health to include a healthy sleep metric as part of its now Life's Essential 8. The sleep metric adopted for sleep was optimal cardiac health is 7 to 9 hours for adults. So basically mirroring that of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and Sleep Research Society. This is a PDF of a document that's available through the International Association of Chief Police. So the link is within the slide. So you could copy that link and actually get a copy of this. I'm not going to read it to you, but there's a portion for the police officer or public safety officer and what they need to do better manage sleep, and then how the family can help. It's very informative and I think very helpful, and it's well worth sharing with police and fire and other public safety personnel. So metabolic syndrome, this first adverse health condition, just what is metabolic syndrome? Well, it's defined by these 5 characteristics. 3 or more of these being present is considered to be metabolic syndrome. So it's defined by elevated waist circumference, or what they call central obesity. So weight we carry around our waist is particularly relevant to health or poor health. So there's a different metric for men and women in this. Elevated triglycerides. So the metric here is more than 150 milligrams of triglycerides per deciliter. You should probably be getting, most people will be getting routine screens for blood lipids, certainly as they get older, and this data should be readily available, or treatment for that condition. So whether you have it or you're getting basically medication for it. Reduce HDL, what's called the good cholesterol. So that's low, below 40 milligrams per deciliter, or one is getting treatment for that. Elevated blood pressure, so hypertension, greater than 30 millimeters of mercury, systolic, that's the higher number in blood pressure, or greater than or equal to 85 millimeters of mercury diastolic blood pressure. That's the pressure in the blood vessels when the heart is not pumping. So between heartbeats. So if that's elevated, showing some level of constriction or restriction within the arterial system, or we're getting treatment for that. And last is the elevated fasting glucose. Or someone with what's called glucose intolerant or insulin resistant. So 3 or more of those present is considered metabolic syndrome. So why does it matter? Well, there was a study done in 2011 to 2016. It was a cross-sectional stratified multi-stage probability sample of the US population. Don't ask me to say that again quick. That elevated trends in metabolic syndrome prevalence among adults at age greater than 20 years of age. And among the more than 17,000 participants, the weighted metabolic syndrome prevalence was 34.7%. So more than a third showed this prevalence of metabolic syndrome. It was even more severe when age was considered, and particularly it was 48.6%, almost 50% for those aged at least 60 years or older. Not good, folks, not good. Why is this important? Well, metabolic syndrome forms a cluster of metabolic dysregulations, insulin resistance, I just mentioned, atherogenic dyslipidemia. So atherogenic means buildup of plaque in the arteries of the body, including the heart arteries in the heart. Central obesity, which I already mentioned, and hypertension. If left untreated, metabolic syndrome is significantly associated with increased risk of developing diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. And given that cardiovascular disease constitute by far the leading cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide, it has become essential to investigate the role played by metabolic syndrome in this context to reduce the heavy burden of that particular disease. There's also something called sudden cardiac death. This goes back to line of duty. This was, I think, a study released in 2015 by those following colleagues. It's called Law Enforcement Duties and Sudden Cardiac Death Among Police Officers in the United States, a case distribution study. They have another slide. You could, and I won't click on that, but if you take that link there, you go to YouTube, it's a little bit, I think a little bit less than 4 minutes long. It identifies those kind of activities that are most closely associated with sudden cardiac death. Obviously, a foot pursuit or a fight or struggle with a suspect during an arrest is very, very high in terms of its correlation with sudden cardiac death when those deaths do occur. So that's likely to be one of the events where it occurs. It's not the only event, by the way, but in that YouTube video, you could basically get within 4 minutes, get all that information. I attended a presentation by John Scheinberg. This was the International Association of Chiefs of Police in the fall of last year. I actually had notes on this page, and I don't have any idea where they went to, and I could not locate them. But I remember asking Dr. Scheinberg, I said, you know, there's all this information about, you know, metrics to identify cardiovascular risk, and he has a particular blood enzyme that seems to be very predictive of cardiovascular risk for police officers. And I hope be able to get that information and share it back with you. But I did ask John this particular question. I said, I've read all this literature about cardiovascular risk and the law enforcement and, you know, various things that contribute to it. No one has said at what point you begin screening. My thought was minimally by age 40. His response was this: if it is non-radiological means, so not using the calcium score, the calcium test, which involves radiation, he says begin at age 30. If it involves radiation, the calcium score test, age 35. That's what he recommends for screening for law enforcement for cardiovascular risk. If we are not doing that, and I think you can extend that to other public safety personnel potentially, if we're not doing that organizationally, if that's not a mandate that we do that, then I think we're doing a disservice to the men and women that do these very difficult jobs within public safety. And I think of this as something that unions would generally support if it's meant to be helpful and in fact not punitive. A little bit moving on to nutrition. This is a recent special edition to Time Magazine about a year or so ago, but this was an interesting quote from that article. Research suggests that half of all deaths due to heart disease could be prevented through changes in lifestyle. It's not just diet, and we'll talk about the movement, fitness, and cardiorespiratory fitness, but including stopping smoking, moving more, and also adopting healthier diets. So these are the lifestyle changes they're talking about. But now just specifically on nutrition, this was a study that was reported in 2017, Journal American Medical Association. It's the association between dietary factors and mortality from heart disease and stroke and type 2 diabetes. So 2 of the 3 leading causes, cancer being the 3rd in America. So they did an estimated mortality evaluation due to heart disease, stroke, or diabetes by looking at suboptimal intakes of 10 dietary factors in the United States. In this 2012, they identified the suboptimal intake of dietary factors associated with an estimated over 300,000 cardiometabolic deaths, representing about 45% of such deaths. This, basically, the suboptimal intake of specific foods and nutrients was associated with a substantial portion of deaths due to heart disease, stroke, or type 2 diabetes. What are those specific foods? Well, I'm glad you asked, because this slide gives you the answer. So a sodium intake of more than 200 milligrams per day, low level of intake of nuts or seeds, less than 20 grams, that's 2/3 of an ounce per day. So less than that. Highly processed meats, any intake was considered to be correlational with an adverse outcome. Low seafood omega-3 fats, so less than 250 milligrams. Low vegetables, less than 400 grams, on and on and on. So I'll read the whole list to you. Excuse me, but those quantities are relatively small, like low grains, 125 grams of low whole grains. That's basically 4 ounces. That's a very small quantity of whole grains. Again, high red meats, unprocessed, less than 14 grams. That's a half an ounce a day. So obviously the inference here is that basically red meat should be avoided. So excuse me one second. The adoption of a healthy heart eating pattern can have far-reaching cardiovascular benefits. That for each 1% reduction in LDL cholesterol or non-HDL cholesterol is associated with a 1% decrease in coronary heart disease event risk over 5 years. That's a pretty good return on that investment because you can reduce your LDL can be reduced, because I've done it through diet, by more, say 30%. Can you imagine a 30% reduced risk for a coronary heart disease event over the next 5 years by doing that? So what are those goals for optimizing the level of LDL cholesterol, so lowering that to the appropriate levels, or non-HDL cholesterol, and reducing atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease? It's the following: achieve a weight loss of 5 to 10% of body weight if overweight, reduce saturated fat intake to less than 7% of total energy, and dietary cholesterol less than 200 milligrams a day, avoid trans fats, reduce intake of added sugars, on and on and on. Excuse me. So what are those triglyceride levels? I basically just copied this out of the Harvard Medical School Special Health Report. I won't obviously read these, but these are available for your review and to evaluate where you may be on that scale. So nutrient density discernment in dietary choices. If we're really going to get the biggest bang for our buck, so to speak, or for our calorie, what are those foods that are most likely to provide it? Well, here's a list that ranks these foods based on the availability of 17 specific nutrients per 100 calorie of food consumed. These 17 nutrients are potassium, fiber, protein, calcium, iron, thiamine, riboflavin, so some of the B vitamins, niacin, folate, zinc, vitamins A, B6, B12, C, D, E, and K. Those are the 17 qualifying nutrients. Top of the list, watercress, Chinese cabbage, and Swiss chard, beet greens, spinach, chicory, leaf lettuce, parsley, romaine lettuce, etc. So basically your leafy green vegetables are the most nutrient dense foods that you consume of those 17 qualifying nutrients per 100 calorie. Kale, dandelion greens, it goes on and on and on. So you're basically looking at primarily vegetables, fruits, a little bit lower on the list. So again, a little follow-up from this study. What do we want to do to reduce our risk for this cardiovascular events? So basically routine healthcare visits. This will be modified maybe just a little bit in the last slide, but basically adults should engage in 150 minutes per week of accumulated moderate intensity or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity to reduce atherosclerotic cardiovascular risk. For adults unable to meet the physical activity recommendations, so there's ones I just mentioned, engage in some moderate or vigorous intensity physical activity, even if less than the recommended amount, still can be beneficial for reducing risk. And then decreasing sedentary behavior in adults that may be reasonable to reduce also this risk. So what are the different kinds of physical activities? So the thing is metabolic equivalent is what a MET is. And I have the definition of that if we need to get a little more specific at the end. But what is a MET? So basically a 1 to 1.5 METs is the amount of energy needed to just sustain the body when you're sitting, reclining, or lying, or watching television. A light activity like walking slowly, cooking, or light housework will generate 1.6 to 2.9 METs, so a little bit more energetic output. Moderate of their 3 to almost 6 METs through brisk walking, 2.4 to 4 miles an hour, biking 5 to 9 miles an hour, ballroom dancing, active yoga, recreational swimming, and then vigorous is running, jogging, biking at faster speeds, singles tennis, and swimming laps. Those are these METs, and I'll get to that in a minute. So a movement study, this was just trying to, it's questioning the gold standard. Do we really need 10,000 steps a day to optimize the health benefit in reducing primarily a cardiovascular risk, but also other risks? I'll mention that the next study. So this particular movement study, this was just published in 2022 in the Lancet Public Health. Compared with adults with the lowest steps per day quartile, so the lowest 25%, adults in the highest steps per quartile, the upper 20, or the highest 25%, had 40 to 53% lower risk of mortality. So that's pretty strong data there. There was progressively lower risk of mortality among adults aged 60 years and older until about 6,000 to 8,000 steps per day, and among adults younger than 60 until 8,000 to 10,000. So it's not necessarily 10,000 for those under 60, somewhere between 8 to 10. For those 60 and over, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000. So certainly much more benevolent metric for those who are in basically higher ages. This is the final study. So this just was published in 2023 in February. So this is literally hot off the press. This is physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness modulators of health outcomes. What they basically say is cardiorespiratory fitness, which is different than exercise and different than movement. They said movement or physical activity, so consider movement, physical activity, and exercise are health practices. The health outcome of those is cardiorespiratory fitness, which is one of the strongest prognostic markers in persons with and without chronic disease, including coronary heart disease. Physical activity also plays an important role in the prevention and treatment of cancer. Higher levels of leisure time physical activity were associated with lower risk of 13 of 26 cancers evaluated. That's pretty important to note. And then in 2020, the World Health Organization guidelines on physical activity advised adults engage, again, this 150-300 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity, but also be complemented by physical strengthening activities 2 days a week or more, and limiting sedentary behaviors. So I might add, this study has a lot of detail in it. I'm going to forward a copy of the Robert. He can send to everyone. But at minimally, at less than 5 METs, so metabolic equivalence, that standard that was referenced in a previous study, at anyone who is generating less than 5 METs of activity, it basically is in a elevated risk category. The benefits for cardiovascular risk prevention or reduction are at greater than 5 METs per day, up to around, I think it was 10 METs per day. It depends actually on your age. And that study has a graph based on age, how many METs per day of energetic output through activities that need to be generated to optimize what they call good health, to be considered in good health. Those who are in exceptional health, there's marginal benefit to those who are in exceptional health. Beyond those in good health, there isn't a lot of reduction beyond people in good health to excellent health in terms of risk reduction. So the recommendation is to try to reach the good standard. So lastly, the different effort is done through the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Museum. they have a program called Destination Zero. So this website has over, I think it's 250 archived wellness programs for law enforcement agencies from across the country. So I really salute their effort. Instead of below 100, their destination is zero deaths. And it's just interesting to note in 2021, one of the recipients of that award was a agency in Montgomery County. And I'm going to play the video that shows everything they put into their wellness program. And they were one of the ones to receive an award for their effort.
Destination Zero National Officer Safety and Wellness Award winners. Now, in the category of General Officer Safety, the winner is the West Carrollton, Ohio Police Department.
West Carrollton, Ohio spans 6.5 square miles just south of Dayton. The West Carrollton Police Department has about 26 sworn officers serving 13,000 residents. To ensure that its officers remain safe while serving their community, the West Carrollton PD is taking a multifaceted approach to addressing officer wellness and resiliency through the institution of new policies and procedures, training, equipment, and programs. To address mental, spiritual, and emotional fitness, the WCPD implemented a peer support program run by officers who are certified mental health counselors. Information shared by officers is confidential and privileged. Every new officer is provided with a copy of Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. All sworn personnel receive an 8-hour training block on mental health first aid, as well as an additional 40 hours of crisis intervention training. For the physical fitness aspect of the program, the WCPD provides a fully equipped gym that is supported by 2 certified fitness instructors and a nutritionist. Officers can work out for 1/2 hour per shift, and the gym and its equipment are available for use by family members as well. Officers also have access to a physical therapist who helps with injury prevention and recovery. To improve officer safety, the WCPD purchased new load-bearing vests to protect them from the common problems caused by traditional soft body armor. They are also easier to put on. To provide officers extra protection, each cruiser is equipped with a patrol rifle, ballistic helmet, ballistic vest, and ballistic shield. Officers are trained on all of the equipment at the firearms training facility, as well as through the use of force simulator. The WCPD has installed go bags that contain first aid supplies, additional ammunition, and other items that may be needed in a tactical situation in all of its patrol vehicles. All officers are trained in first aid and tourniquet use. A certified traffic instructor works with officers on the tactics involved in traffic stops and defensive tactics training. The agency is one of the first in its area to allow officers to grow facial hair and have visible tattoos. In an effort to receive input from its officers, the West Carrollton Police Department created a recommendations committee, providing officers the opportunity to offer ideas or suggestions regarding the internal workings of the department. And any department member can nominate an officer for one of the many agency awards available. Since implementing its officer safety program, the West Carrollton Police Department has seen great successes and plans to continue to add new elements to help keep its officers and the community they serve safe and well.
And that's it. And certainly open to any questions you may have.
Folks, you're welcome to unmute and speak up. Ask the chief anything you'd like. Any comments, questions, thoughts?
Oh, I'm a Leslie student.
You are currently?
Currently, yeah, I'm finishing September 3rd. I graduate.
Oh my God, so next fall?
No, I'm doing the adult program, so I'm finishing at my own pace.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Chief, it feels overwhelming to have so many areas. I mean, so where would you start?
Well, I'd start with sleep. I really would, because nothing goes good if that's not right. In fact, the effects of inadequate sleep are immediate. So the longer health consequences of that in terms of cardiovascular illness, cancer, whatever, certainly a little bit more downstream, but our performance suffers immediately. So I would start with sleep, really do something to promote good sleep hygiene. That we should be monitoring the number of hours that police officers are working. Certainly duty related, off-duty details, but also if they're working extension of police services. So in other words, they're working with the authority, the police authority that's granted the very agency, those hours should be reported and they also should be audited. How often officers are going to court?
But it's
We
a
should be
vicious
tracking
cycle.
it.
Like
Pardon?
we don't have staffing, so we can't fill the shifts, and then everyone's doing overtime. It's a vicious cycle. So it's like, how do we stop this vicious cycle? Is recruitment, but I don't think that's good. It's a
Yeah,
vicious.
recruitment's, that's a 2-year solution, right? You start now and 2 years later, you get somebody duty ready. So that's certainly a lateral transfer, something that Dayton never did. They began doing lateral transfer, trying to fill staffing challenges. So I don't know what various agencies are doing, but if not doing lateral entry, they need to consider to expedite onboarding folks. But we did different. Do you do 10-hour shift? We actually did a shift analysis, and so we looked where was the workload or work demand, and we deployed personnel based on workload, not equal shifts that rotate like when I first came on, which was crazy. Same amount of officers on every shift, you just rotated through all the shifts. So Dayton went to a 4-10 shift, 4 10-hour shifts back, oh gosh, several years ago. And it basically matched personnel to workload. And getting 3 days off a week was, out of 7 was a pretty good deal. So basically of all the shift studies I've ever looked at, 10-hour days seem to be the best meeting officers' life needs as well as their health needs, family needs. So I would be looking at shifts, how shifts are determined, what hours they are, number of personnel assigned. The other thing is, a lot of agencies, like particularly in tourist destinations, they hire part-timers during peak demand. So I know a lot of unions.
Yeah, and Maine, that's how they're
part-time.
doing. Yeah.
But yet, I think that's a conversation with the union going, if you're really interested in our wellness and safety, we need staffing. And if it's going to retirees who are willing to come back and work part-time, or the other folks hired on just to be working part-time, we should be exploring that. So I think everything should be on the table in terms of options. It's just saying, oh, we can't do that. We can't do, no. We need to be creative. In fact, I always said that probably the Great Recession was a gift in many ways, because one thing that would happen in Dayton, we couldn't afford to keep doing business the way we were doing. We needed to change how we delivered service. We needed to change how we were structured, or we were going to fail because we didn't have the people anymore to staff and supply and respond to workload based on the way we're currently doing things. So we had to change. So it ought to be a mandate to change, evaluating what runs you don't go on anymore. We elevated the amount of cost of damage for auto accident that would mandate a police report. So we have something called a non-investigative crash report. for minor damages. So the typical auto accident report takes over an hour. We looked at how we did business.
So Chief, I have a question. Since you mentioned that sleep deprivation has an immediate effect, in the immediate situation before administrative changes, before policy changes, do you see practices, abilities to coach individuals around their sleep hygiene, their sleep routines, to support them to have more sleep and better, more restorative sleep? Is that a possibility even?
In terms of coaching folks?
Absolutely, coaching enforcement folks and yeah.
Coaching and even surveying, and I would suggest to be an outside agency. I think minimally every quarter, but I think it should be done monthly. Should be have folks complete a survey on basically sleep quality, sleep duration, sleep quality. The other thing I'm gonna let a cat out of the bag here. I've had a lot of days of poor sleep, particularly in the last few years of my career, because it was one crisis and tragedy after another. It was relentless. I have never seen or experienced the things that what happened in 2019 and 2020 at any time in my career. It was just knee-jarring. What I found is if I would get up and I would do 5, 10, or 15 minutes of practice, rhythmic movement, integrated breathing, with full attention to what I was experiencing, full attention, literally, sometimes as little as 5 minutes of that could offset some of the sleep deficit. I would have better energy throughout the day. So more of a consistent energy through the day. It was more emotionally calm. I was able to process information and make decisions at a really rapid pace, which is required as a police chief. You don't have a lot of time to be pondering things for days because there's a lot more piling on top of the thing you didn't solve today if you don't get today's business done today. So I found that practice was literally an antidote, not a solution for poor sleep, but an antidote for that day, with then a commitment to try to get better sleep pattern restored when allowed. Some days, I mean, during the Oregon District mass shooting, I had about two or 3 hours of sleep, and I went for 20 hours straight after that. And then every day was intense all day long, no breaks. So it's just, you're just going to have some deficits at sometimes during those kind of crises. There's no avoiding it. I didn't have a normal day until Thursday that week. It was interesting. I did a practice that morning. So finally I was able to get a practice Thursday. Shooting happened on this Saturday morning, early morning hours. And I actually began to have a really good day. I was having a really good day. But then, you know, the voice started with, how can you have a good day? These people are dead. They're never coming back. It's never going to change. We can't unwind that. And then I had to pause and go, wait a minute. You deserve to have a good day. Nothing is going to change by you having a bad day. The fact that people died in this tragic way. So I had to do a little bit of self-check with the interior dialogue that was going on and say, I deserve to have a good day. But literally practice is, I think, essential during these times, but there'll be some days go by, it'd be days, plural. You don't have time for it. If it's not that kind of a crisis, I think that daily early morning practice is crucial. And I found it was crucial for me through a whole lot of years. So I didn't mention that in a presentation, but I'm going to tell you, it was vital to me throughout my career.
Well, Chief, I want to acknowledge that we're just a little bit over our scheduled time, but what I'm seeing here is this potential connection between yourself and our resident trainer with ISP, and what thoughts, or I'd love to hear you in dialogue, the two of you, around what kind of training can go to troopers in the academy at the beginning of their career, that even if we just were talking about sleep,
Mhm.
the two of you, what you might come up with as what's real good practice, what's the best practice or good practice to drop in those men and women's laps and see if they can have a steady career, thriving career.
It'd be a
Yeah,
great
the-
opportunity.
Yeah, the sleep is that in the academy is, we somewhat dictate it, obviously, with the amount of hours we train them. But then there are also those days we're going to work those recruits 12-hour days from 8 a.m. until we have to do night shooting. And then they're up. But we also, from my standpoint, being the health specialist, is trying to educate them of trying to get, you can't bank sleep, but trying to get a better night's sleep the night before, maybe go to bed an hour earlier, try to get that rest. Can we do a micro nap after lunch, get a, yoga nidra for 10 minutes? Can we just even lay and work on breath work, as the chief said? Because as we teach them the breath work, you don't necessarily have to sleep, but can you just rest to turn the brain off for a little bit of time, hopefully to recruit, and then they might get 2 to 3 hours off somewhere in that day. And again, is trying to get them to understand, and then also allow the staff and me to train my staff to let the recruits nap. Let them go upstairs for 2 hours. If some can't nap, just let them rest. Give them downtime to let their brain turn off a little bit. And also instruct, as the chief said, is giving them the tools and explaining how it works, and then start to implement them. And also keep, maybe like he said, a sleep journal. We're trying to work on having our recruits write down the time they put their head in bed and the time they get up in the morning, so they start to chart the time that they are actually in bed. Because most of the time we don't know when we fall asleep. We may not have a watch on, or you don't really know when you fall asleep, but at least you're in bed at 10, I'm up
Mhm.
at 5. Am I being consistent? And then tell them to carry that over to the weekend, and not just, hey, now that I'm home, I can catch up on Netflix till 3 a.m. and I'm good.
Yeah, this Apple Watch is an incredible metric. There's something called auto sleep. So that's one of the apps, which does a really good job, I think, of tracking sleep. The heart rate variability I mentioned previously, because if I wake up 4 or 5 in the morning and it's way too early to get up, I'll go into paced breathing and it distorts the heart rate variability because it thinks I'm sleeping because I'm not moving. I'm just breathing. So it's not perfect as a biometric device. But I really appreciate just the app to keep a track on sleep and quality sleep, and particularly deep sleep.
It's going to be hard to do this with corrections because we're we have no staff. I walked in, they're like walking around like zombie. Like we're putting zombies in our front lines, basically.
Yep.
And it just feels like it's never going to end because everyone's working so much overtime and no one's coming in. Everyone's leaving. So.
That's how it is for the staff in our jail. But I think one of the reasons I feel so hopeful about sleep is even with staffing shortages and working overtime, there's usually something that people can do to improve their sleep. I mean, you may not get as much time watching your show, but Annette Zapp, who's a wonderful friend of Troy's, and then I met her at a conference. A few people have probably known her, but she always says, if you wouldn't stay up to do it, if you wouldn't wake up early to do it, don't stay up to do it. And I think drinking and alcohol is another one that is within people's control. And the high rates of it are kind of symptomatic of a lot of the problems that Chief Beal was talking about today, but it's something that can be done. It's not completely helpless or completely dependent on on other people.
Right, but we have to start them off in the beginning of their training with the overall wellness coping mechanism, and yeah, when you're putting people through so much overtime, a lot of jails are suffering. People are just they can't close the jail, so people are taking on way more than they can handle, and it's a really big issue. But I know we can't solve it right now, so.
I'd just like to say thank you, Richard. And I guess I would have asked the same question Katie asked at the point, because I think you mentioned earlier that the presentation tonight was going to be like a fire hose, of information. But, grabbing onto that one thing we can make a difference in, and Katie's reference to the Annette Zapp question, I think is helpful. But and just your affirmation about how valuable the breath practice was and the sit time was at key points in your very stressful periods of your service. So it's very helpful to me, and kind of gives me some reason to start getting serious about my triglycerides and some of that stuff too. So very helpful information. Thanks.
You're welcome. One thing I'll mention too, in terms of better sleep, exercise. So there's really also exposure to the sun, by the way. We're supposed to get exposure to sun early in the morning and then mid-afternoon to help set our circadian rhythm. So exposure to sunlight helps get our body in sync, our sleep cycles in sync. Also, exercise helps us sleep better, as long as it isn't too close to bedtime, because we're still going to have elevated metabolism, can carry over a couple hours after exercising, which will prevent us from going to sleep. So we can't exercise too late in the evening if we're on a day shift, because we're gonna have a hard time going to sleep, getting to sleep.
Yeah, and eating healthy instead of caffeine, because the healthy food will give you the energy instead of like the same thing that caffeine would give you. So if it
And
tell them not
alcohol,
really.
alcohol before bed, it's a CNS depressant, and there's the rebound effect. When it wears off, nervous system goes the other direction, so it interrupts sleep. So the nightcap's not a good idea.
Chief, I'd like to thank you for a really informative presentation. I'm guessing that people's questions could take this on all evening, because you went into so many areas that not only affect people who are in the force and first responders, but all of us. I mean, you don't have to be doing that for a living to have these sleep issues or dietary issues. This is just a real quick question, and maybe it's not something that is answerable, but throughout you were talking about a lot of studies with various statistics.
Mm-hmm.
Is most of this self-report, or are they actually sending people for, like a physical periodically, so you can actually get the levels that, your blood tests and your HDL and LDL and all the rest of it? Meaning, for some of these things that you were speaking to, it sounds like if there was a policy to have people get regular or more than regular checkups, and then of course self-report, how are you doing for the last month in sleep or whatever, which people might not be as honest and forthright as what comes out on a physical.
Yeah, Sam Walker is a sleep scientist. So they actually have sleep labs. So they're pulling lab data. So this is a pretty controlled environment. Some are doing, they'll do surveys. If what I'm suggesting is to do a survey, now people can either be candid in that or not. I also would suggest that a survey done of public safety personnel not be done by the agency, done by some outside entity, hopefully a health serving organization that's doing the survey, because folks won't trust it if it's going to the chief or whoever. It's not going to fly. So someone who their business is someone's health and is completely independent with only aggregate results reported, not individual results. Individuals' identity is kept confidential.
I took a class with the American Military University. They probably have a lot more information on this if you need. It was Stress and Law Enforcement class by Jared Sadowski or something. I keep pronouncing his name wrong. But yeah, he gave us a lot of studies. There's a lot of studies being done on this.
You said in the military? American
Military University.
Okay. Because
they had a stress and law enforcement class. They provided tons of studies for specifically sleep. We spent a lot of time on sleep and chronic fatigue. Yeah, it was a big part of the class.
I know the U.S. Army has a manual for health and wellness that exceeds, and I was a part of the working group for the President's Commission for Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice. Ours was the Officer Safety, Health, and Wellness Working Group. There were 2 paragraphs on sleep. The United States military had far more in their manual on sleep than law enforcement had out of this commissioned report. It was just inadequately addressed. So it's good to know the American University.
Yeah, no,
University doing.
like I think 2 of the weeks, and it was like a fast class, 2 of the units were like all about chronic fatigue and how it causes everything else.
Yeah.
And it's scary. Like, and all these early deaths could be prevented if we just dealt with the chronic fatigue and the fatigue.
Anyone ever notice when you're tired, you immediately go to the carbs? You notice that? I have. So, which are not good health choices because they're usually high sugar, not complex carbohydrates, but it gives you the energy boost, right? That's why we do it. So, or drink that next extra cup of coffee you shouldn't have. Yeah, we go to the go-to things to try to get past the energy slump.
Right. Well, Rafi, I appreciate your description of the cycle, what we sometimes call the unvirtuous cycle. And I think that those of us gathered here have some of the answers to change that cycle, to reverse that cycle, because this work, these careers can be incredibly rewarding. These people are coming with a sense of purpose, with a sense of service. And I would just like to see all of us here as we can to collaborate, to work together and see what we can do to provide wellness, to provide training, to provide whatever we can to help people manage through these. If it's going to take a year or 2 or a couple of years to get more recruitment happening, to get higher retention rates, and that's going to happen when people are healthier, right? That's going to happen when people feel like they're being taken care of. They know they're being taken care of, and they are able to thrive. And I was really struck that presentation by the PD in Ohio, talking about mental, emotional, and spiritual resilience, and how that reflects directly on 3 of the issues that are addressed with mindfulness-based wellness and resiliency training. So obviously there's a lot of training out there, but there are some commonalities for wellness to be addressed, for normal human natural needs to be addressed, recognized, and promoted.
I think
So-
people are scared of mindfulness for the reason that there's studies about PTSD and mindfulness, and then they just shut down, and then they don't want to hear about it, because if you do certain meditations, it can increase PTSD. So some people see that and then they're like, mindfulness is evil, it's bad, So we need more studies done on that stuff so that there's
More
clarity.
studies. Yeah, I agree. More studies. I'm right now in the middle of a mindfulness teachers training retreat, and those few studies that have been made come up always in conversation, and those retreats came from people doing very intensive, deep, silent retreat, as opposed to officers who may be in a room, just as Susan and Gary can and Katie and Robert can reflect, who are doing a 5-minute practice or a 10-minute practice. And Chief, as you had said, spending 15 minutes in the morning can be so beneficial, right? We're not talking about putting people, in a quiet room, in a dark room for 20 days at 12 hours a day, or whatever it is, So it's unfortunate those are out there. They're out there and they do need to be responded to. And mindfulness isn't necessarily for everybody, but for the vast, vast majority of people, there are so many benefits, and there's so much science and understanding literature behind the multiple veins of benefit, physiologically, emotionally, mentally. Yeah, thanks.
I did that presentation of mindfulness and law enforcement. Is it the right tool in a trauma intense environment? And I addressed those very issues of where mindfulness at time could be triggering potentially with someone unresolved trauma. And I really kind of worked to break down where it's most likely to be beneficial to start. When I was going through depression, which I really think, quite honestly, going back earlier in life, there was a trauma component to that. I went back first to the body. I couldn't spend any time in my mind. It was not a good place to be. I went back to something familiar, the body. I was a power lifter. I was a competitive martial artist. I was comfortable in the body. I went back to the body. So that began with a yoga practice. And I really didn't even understand completely what I was doing at the time. The breath came about 6 months later after I thought I almost would die doing these practices. I realized a lot of times I was holding my breath as I was doing the practice, which we'll do at times when we concentrate. When I saw it, I realized I don't need to breathe. Then it almost became effortless. The mindfulness was the last piece to come along for me, where I could actually be aware of this downward spiral and choose not to go. It's great to have antidote to get out. It's best not to go there. That's the beginning of true freedom. That's where mindfulness became important. But
Yeah,
I
the
had to
tactical
start with the
breathing.
body.
Yeah. But the tactical breathing definitely helps. And like
Yes.
it can help with heart problems down the
Yes.
line and everything.
Yes.
But like you have to explain to people that there's two types, and one might not be good for PTSD, but the other is. So, it's just giving clarity to people.
I agree.